Have you ever left an argument knowing that you won, but still feeling like you lost? Have you ever noticed how something in you craves the next blow-up, even as it exhausts and disorients you? You tell yourself you hate conflict. You tell others you don't like drama. But part of you deeper down is drawn to it. You feel the electricity before it begins. You feel the silence in the air before the storm hits, and it feels like a familiar rhythm. Maybe it starts as a conversation, a question, a comment, a tiny pinch of tension. You respond, they respond, and then it spirals. Suddenly your voice is raised, clipped. Your heart is pounding. You're not even sure what you're defending anymore, but you need to finish the point. You need to be heard. Except you're not being heard. Because this was never about understanding. It was about control, validation, dominance, safety. And now you're trapped again in the loop. What if I told you that loop is an addiction? That arguing for some is not about communication. It's about chasing the next fix of emotional release. Just like any other high, it starts with a tension, a need. It escalates. Then comes the crash, shame, regret, withdrawal. But afterwards, something strange happens. You feel calm, briefly, peacefully, as if, for a moment, things are finally quiet. And that contrast, the sudden drop from war to stillness, becomes the thing you start craving. Not the fight, but the relief that follows. You don't realize it, but you're chasing that silence and stillness through chaos. That's how it hooks you. That's why it's so hard to leave it behind. Because the argument, the raised voices, the emotional swings create certainty. Certainty that you're alive. Certainty that they still care. Certainty that something is happening even if it's all wrong. You confuse the noise for connection. And if you grew up around conflict, raised voices might even feel like home. Your nervous system has been trained to feel safe in the storm and terrified in the quiet. But here's the truth no one tells you. You're not addicted to conflict. You're addicted to the illusion of power that conflict brings. And that illusion is costing you everything: peace, trust, emotional intimacy, connection. Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So let me ask you this. How many arguments will you have to lose before you realize there was no prize to win? Because until you see the pattern, until you see what's really driving it, you'll keep reacting, keep defending, keep bleeding into conversations that were never meant to heal you. This is the cycle, but it doesn't have to be your identity. Let's go deeper. No one is born addicted to conflict, but from the moment we take our first breath, we're being trained, subtly, repeatedly, to fight for space. You weren't handed this pattern, you inhaled it. Perhaps it started with raised voices behind closed doors, parents at war over dinner, silences that stung louder than shouting. Maybe no one taught you how to disagree without fear or how to speak without needing to shout. But the conditioning runs deeper than family. Our society teaches you to argue long before you even learn to speak. School rewards competition, not cooperation. Politics is a theatre of conflict, win or be destroyed. Even reality TV has turned rational dysfunction into binge-worthy entertainment. It's not just that we tolerate arguments, we consume them. We rehearse them, and eventually we become them. Somewhere along the line, arguing became confused with mattering. It became the language of being seen. You learned that if you made yourself loud, you wouldn't be overlooked. That pushing back meant protecting your dignity. That to lose the argument was to lose your worth. But here's the trap. When arguing becomes the default, the emotional pattern gets wired in, and your nervous system, always scanning for threat, becomes addicted to the familiarity of friction. You begin to seek out tension without realizing it, not because you enjoy the chaos, but because the silence in between feels unbearable. Jung taught that our shadow contains every trait we disown, and for many the shadow holds our buried need for peace, our yearning to be heard without shouting, to rest without defending. But if no one ever modeled that for you, then calm starts to feel foreign, unsafe even. So instead, you reach for the next provocation, not because you're broken, because at some point when you were too young to choose better, someone taught you that being loud was the only way not to be invisible. And your brain learned that confrontation is connection, and we all crave connection. This isn't your fault, but it is your responsibility to do better now. We don't rise by blaming the people who trained us into patterns. We rise by recognizing when the training no longer serves us. You see, what was once armor has become a cage, and unless we interrupt it, we'll pass the same blueprint down to our partners, our children, and our inner selves. You were never meant to build your sense of self-worth in battle. It's not sustainable, it's not safe, and it's not strength. It's just what you learned. But what you learned, you can unlearn. And the moment you decide that peace is no longer a threat, but a birthright, is the moment the pattern starts to dissolve. In the next section, we'll begin that unlearning. We'll separate your identity from the pattern and show you how being drawn into arguments is not a flaw, it's a clue. Let's keep going. There's a cost to living in constant combat mode, and it doesn't always come as an explosion. Sometimes it comes as erosion. You don't even notice it at first, not really. You just feel tired. More tired than you should. You tell yourself it's the workload, the bills, the weather, your hormones, but deep down something in you knows. It's the tension that's never ending. It's the invisible war you're always fighting. That argument you had 3 days ago, you're still replaying it in your head, aren't you? Still crafting the perfect comeback in the shower. Still feeling your heart spike when their name lights up your phone. Still resenting yourself for what you said or what you didn't. This is the hidden burnout, the slow theft of your peace. Arguing doesn't just waste time, it wastes life force. It spikes your cortisol, it floods your nervous system, it compresses your chest and clenches your jaw and keeps you lying awake rehearsing futures that never come. You want clarity? Try to make a big life decision after a week of petty spats and emotional hangovers. Try being creative, grounded, powerful when your inner world is still echoing with someone else's voice. That's the thing. Constant arguing doesn't just affect the moment, it affects the momentum. And then there's the toll on your body. Did you notice the headaches, the tinnitus, the digestive issues, the fatigue that a weekend nap won't fix? Chronic stress doesn't knock loudly, it slips through the cracks, and before you know it, your body becomes a battlefield too. And the emotional tax? You stop trusting yourself. You start questioning whether you're too much, too reactive, too sensitive. You bend yourself into silence to avoid the next outburst, or worse, you start provoking just to feel something real again. And financially, you think arguments don't touch your bank account? Think again. Arguing eats time. It drains energy that could have been used to build, create, focus. It creates tension in your business, in teams, in partnerships. It limits you more than you realize. And the deepest cost, you stop feeling safe inside your own skin. Because when arguing becomes your default setting, your nervous system forgets how to rest. You live in a constant state of readiness, scanning every moment for threat, attack, betrayal, and it's exhausting. You weren't built for battle, not every day. But here's the good news. Your body, your brain, your heart, they all remember what peace feels like. And once you learn how to give it back to yourself, the addiction starts to fade. Next, we'll go to the root of it, why this pattern has stuck for so long, and how to reclaim your power without needing to prove it in an argument. Let's keep moving. She didn't think of herself as someone who argues. She thought of herself as someone who explains things well. Things that people should understand. Things that would make life easier, better, if only they listened. But they don't. Not properly. So she tries again. A little firmer this time. A little louder. The partner always misunderstanding her. The manager always missing the point. The friends not getting it. So she corrects. She clarifies. And she escalates. It doesn't feel like arguing, not to her. It feels like defending the truth. But the truth isn't landing, not how she wants it to. And so, the tone shifts. The warmth cools. The tempo of the conversation quickens. She interrupts, gets interrupted, interrupts again. Somewhere along the line, this became normal. She doesn't throw plates. She doesn't scream. But her life is filled with verbal tug-of-wars, little arm wrestles in disguise. She's exhausted and yet dependent upon it. After one particularly draining exchange, a Sunday night discussion that stretched until 1 a.m., she lay in bed next to someone she used to adore and realized she couldn't remember the last time they simply sat in silence together and felt safe. It had become a pattern, tension, flare, fallout, then temporary, blissful peace. The peace always felt like a relief, a reward, as though surviving the chaos had earned it. And that's when it hit her. She wasn't addicted to conflict. She was addicted to the relief that came after. And like all addiction, the tolerance had increased. She needed bigger outbursts, more intense confrontations to fill the same emotional drop. Like waiting for the crash after the caffeine, the stillness after the storm. It's easy to say, just stop arguing, but What if you don't realize it's happening? What if it feels like connection, or at least the closest thing you know? She tried being quieter, she tried detaching, but the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt empty, lonely, like she didn't matter. So she went back to arguing. At least it meant being seen, at least it meant feeling something. But slowly, something shifted. She stopped explaining herself when there was no space to be heard. She started answering questions with questions, not accusations. She let other people sit with their discomfort. And finally, someone snapped one day, someone trying to bait her into an old pattern. She simply said, "I'm not interested in having that conversation anymore," and walked away. They didn't follow. That night, she sat in the quiet, alone. But this time, it didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like a beginning. What if the real power isn't in the final word, but in the refusal to play a rigged game? Let's look at why we cling to these patterns even when they hurt us, and what breaking free could really mean. So much of what we call conflict is just memory. Not in the obvious way, not "I remember what you did to me," but in the subtler, deeper way. I remember the feeling of being powerless, and I refuse to feel that again. Arguing becomes your shield, your armor, your proof that this time you won't be walked over. But here's the brutal truth. Each time you suit up for battle, you reinforce the belief that the world can still defeat you. That you're not safe unless you're armed. The awakening begins here. Not when someone else changes, not when they finally see your side, but when you realize you don't need to fight to be free. You don't need to convince anyone to validate your truth. Your reality is valid without performance, and your peace is yours, not a trophy someone hands you after a debate. The moment you stop saying, "They made me react that way," and start asking, "Why did I hand them that power?" is the moment you begin to win. This isn't about shame, it's about sovereignty. You've already made progress even by being here, even by listening to these words, letting them settle. It means you're not fully asleep anymore. You're watching yourself from the outside. You're recognizing your triggers before you act on them. Maybe you bit your tongue yesterday. Maybe you chose silence when you could have chosen sarcasm. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. Radical responsibility doesn't mean blaming yourself for everything. It means owning your reactions and your power to redirect them. It's saying, yes, I was conditioned this way, but I don't have to keep rehearsing pain. What a relief. What a breath of air through tightly coiled lungs of your nervous system. You don't need to win an argument to reclaim your energy. You just need to stop auditioning for approval you never needed in the first place. When you shift the focus from who was wrong to who you want to be, you stop bleeding into other people's battles. You pick your peace like a suit that finally fits. You walk into conversations not to conquer, but to connect, and you choose when to walk away, not as a retreat, but as an act of power. And in that choice, you become free. Let's talk now about the real recovery, how to break the cycle and finally stay out of the ring. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Let's talk about that irritation, that bite, That spike of adrenaline that rises in the throat when someone challenges you, interrupts you, dismisses your perspective. What if that sensation, that impulse to fight, isn't about them at all? According to Jung, what you see and react to in others often reflects a disowned part of you. He called this the shadow, the unconscious aspects of ourselves that we deny, reject, or repress. When you argue, especially compulsively or repeatedly, you're not just defending a belief, you're wrestling with your own shadow. The part of you that feels powerless, that fears being dismissed, that aches to be seen, and fights dirty when it's ignored. But here's the truth. Arguing feels powerful when you feel unseen. It's not about logic. It's about being heard, not by them, by yourself. Let's go deeper. In Jungian theory, the shadow isn't evil. It's unintegrated. You weren't born defensive or explosive or sharp-tongued. Those were coping tools your psyche forged to survive in a world that didn't listen, didn't validate, didn't offer safety when you needed it most. So you raised your voice, you became quick-witted, you sharpened your inner critic into a sword, and now you're tired. Because that voice wasn't meant to shout forever. When someone triggers you, and you leap into argument, you're not just responding to the present, you're reacting from a library of past pain. It's the shadow's language. It doesn't care if you're right, it only knows you've been wronged, and until you face it, until you integrate it, it'll drive the argument while convincing you it's self-expression. Here's the shift. When you recognize that voice not as your enemy, but as your wounded protector, you gain choice. You can say, there you are, I see you, but I choose peace this time. It's not suppression, it's integration. When you meet the part of you that's addicted to being right, that fears irrelevance, that equates silence with defeat, you reclaim your voice from the grip of your shadow. You stop fighting to feel significant. You start listening to feel whole. So ask yourself, what part of you are you fighting through others? And are you ready to bring that part home? Because true resolution doesn't come from winning the argument. It comes from winning the war within. You don't stop arguing by biting your tongue. You stop by changing who you are when conflict appears. At first it's subtle. Someone challenges you at work, dismisses your idea in that half-smirking, faux polite tone. The old pattern bubbles. Clench, defend, escalate. But this time, you pause. You take the breath you never used to allow. You feel the burn behind your ribs, the rising voice in your throat, and you don't unleash it. Not because you're weak, not because you're avoiding, but because you're choosing power that doesn't perform. You respond with brevity. Noted, let's revisit that later. Then you move on, clean, unhooked. And after the meeting you hear your colleague mutter, "Bit cold, wasn't he?" That's your next test. Because growth is not applause. It's silence, suspicion, discomfort. People will try to bait you. Poke, prod, pull you back into the version of you that used to rise and rage. Not because they miss your anger, but because it validates theirs. Now you don't give them the satisfaction. Your partner brings up the same complaint they've rehearsed 100 times before, the one that used to erupt into a late-night shouting match. This time, you say calmly, "I understand you're frustrated, but I won't keep having the same fight. If this matters to you, Bring me a solution, not a target. And then you go for a walk. No slamming doors, no reactive tears, just the simple exit from a game you no longer wish to play. At first, this will feel unnatural. You'll crave the dopamine hit of the win, the sense of superiority, the theatre of a good row. But give it time, because slowly the silence will stop feeling like punishment. It will start to feel like peace. You'll begin to hear your own thoughts without them echoing in someone else's rage. You'll choose not to respond to the late-night message, not out of avoidance, but because you've stopped mistaking access for intimacy. You'll recognize that your voice matters more when used less, when it's not flung like a weapon, but offered as a deliberate, considered truth. And when people start to notice, they'll say, "You've changed," with suspicion or contempt. And you'll smile, not in arrogance, but in quiet confirmation. Yes, you have. You are no longer the person who argues to feel heard. You're becoming the one who hears themselves and needs no defense. There will come a moment, quiet, unexpected, when someone tries to drag you into the old rhythm. They'll say something sharp, they'll roll their eyes, they'll bait you with a tone dipped in disrespect, and you'll feel it, the heat in your chest, the words forming fast behind your teeth, the old you ready to leap, but you won't. Because you're no longer performing. You're no longer auditioning for love in the form of being right. You've stepped off that stage. This isn't about silence as suppression. It's about silence as sovereignty. You now understand that not everything deserves a response. Not every provocation warrants your presence. Because you've remembered something sacred. You have a limited number of breaths on this earth, and none of them were meant to be wasted on proving your worth to someone who can't see it. You're not addicted to arguing. You were starved of calm and mistook conflict for connection. Now you know better, and because you know better, you do better. You spend your days with people who bring peace, not spikes. You choose relationships that don't require emotional gymnastics to feel safe. You raise your children, your teams, your voice, not in volume, but in value. You lead with clarity. You love without chaos. And when you feel yourself slipping, because you will, you don't collapse in shame. You just return. Return to the truth you've built with your own two hands. This is what becoming looks like. Not perfection, not constant strength, but a pattern broken, a cycle ended, a new story written in real time. You are not the sum of your arguments. You are the space you hold between the noise. So now, take a breath, the kind that fills you, not fuels you. And say it in the comments below. Not for me, not for the algorithm, but for the future version of you who's waiting to be heard. I choose peace this time. And if this touched you, don't stop here. The next video is waiting. Let's go even deeper. Because this journey, it's only just begun.